Some of you guys have heard about the locust plagues of East Africa.
These bugs have infested farmland and destroyed crops. Farmers are calling on the international community to help prevent a food crisis.
And this is actually a very, very big deal. Excuse me, Maverick. Shh. He hears the word locust, it's our rooster, and he thinks I'm hungry, right? First of all, there are hundreds of billions. There are billions.
The United Nations says the region needs around $76 million to combat the crisis. Officials warn the locust outbreak will spread across the entire continent of Africa.
And this is a very serious problem. You've read some reports saying that the locusts are eating enough food to feed a couple thousand people. That's in a few hours. We're actually talking about in a 24-hour period, these swarms are eating enough food to feed 35,000 people, and the swarms are expected to grow by 500-fold between now and June. So this is something that we all need to be paying attention to, because this is going to cause a food shortage in Africa, but that food shortage is going to continue to spill over in what I would consider an already delicate environment for crops. I think the coronavirus has really kind of buried this story, and along with some other things, but this is a very, very big story. It's getting bigger. The only way that they're going to be able to get this under control is by expensing a lot of pesticides that are going to cause a lot of problems. I think that this is going to be an issue that we're not done seeing the end of anytime soon. So basically, these locusts are grasshoppers. They're a type of grasshopper that live in the desert. They're desert grasshoppers, and they basically put their eggs into moist soil for the baby grasshoppers to be born, and then they immediately need vegetation. What happened is back in 2018, we saw a lot of rain in May in the southern desert of Omar, very remote part of our planet. Nobody knew what was going on. And then we saw a lot of rain again in October. So in that May rain, what we had was a perfect breeding and reproduction environment for the desert grasshopper. And each generation grows by 20 to 40 times actually. And so in October you had a lot of heavy rains again, and these heavy rains are creating the ability for vegetation growth out in the desert, as well as that damp soil that they like to lay their eggs in, and they basically become a larger and larger swarm. After the October rains of 2018, the swarm grew and moved. They start to move. They can move in swarms up to 90 miles a day. I'm going to get in a little bit more about this grasshopper because it's a very fascinating grasshopper. But they can move by 90 miles a day. And then they moved into Iran and Yemen. And normally Yemen would battle this problem, but because Yemen has been stuck in basically a war zone for the past couple years, Yemen wasn't able to expense the resources to battle this grasshopper problem, this locust problem when it came up. Yemen has always had a good first line of defense, and you can look at this situation and see where it started to spiral out of control. Because then again in 2019, what did we have? A lot of rain. We're in a period of grand solar minimum, which typically coincides with a lot of regional downpours. And so these locust swarms are swarming to these different locations. They got hit with another downpour of rain, which gave them, again, the perfect breeding environment. And they've pretty much had that scenario. They crossed the Gulf and went into, East Africa, and they've just been, through Kenya, Somalia, all of these East African countries. I think there's something like somewhere between 20 and 30 countries that have now been in some way impacted by these swarms of locusts. So when this very, tannish looking grasshopper out in the desert is able to reproduce like this and is able to thrive and becomes a part of these swarms, it actually goes through a metamorphosis, kind of like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type scenario, or, think of the Incredible Hulk. it changes the dynamics of this grasshopper, and it turns actually kind of a yellow and black instead of that desert tan that it used to be as it goes through this metamorphosis. And again, you know, what happens to the Incredible Hulk when it gets really big and mean is his muscles grow. And so these grasshoppers have these growing muscles. They've got to eat more food. They're on a plant-based diet. They got to get that protein somehow, which means they need a lot of carbs. And grains are a great source to get those carbs and proteins. And so you're going to start to see these locusts swarming into these countries and going after the crops. The crops become the best thing for them to eat. Now that yellow and black color they turn actually means that they're toxic, and that's a warning sign to predators that that animal is toxic, because they are, as they go through that metamorphosis, they're actually driven to eat plant toxins. Those plant toxins change the biological makeup of the grasshopper. They become toxic to predators because their color change tells predators, I can't eat you anymore. And that just further enables the swarms to grow and become out of control. And this is going to continue until we hit a dry spell and they aren't able to reach, you know, areas of that dampness that they're able to recreate on. And the fact that we grow so many crops probably makes it worse because it enables them even more. They're able to eat more. They're eating all the food we're growing for 8 billion people on our planet. So they're able to eat more. They're able to reproduce more in a solar minimum environment, and they're able to just continue to expand and grow. And that's why between now, I mean, this is a problem that started in 2018. We didn't start hearing any news coverage of it really until the beginning of 2020. And that's because these swarms have gotten so big by the billions. Hundreds of billions. I mean, if you look at the pictures of these things out in East Africa, this is huge. It's the biggest plague we've seen in several centuries, and they're just moving through the country after country, eating up crops. And countries are fighting this off with pesticides. There's no other way that they can successfully try and shut these swarms down other than pesticides, and they haven't necessarily been all that effective yet. And you have to realize that with those pesticides, they're also killing off other essential insects for our environment. And so it's not just, you know, a plague. It's not just affecting food supply. It's not just affecting the citizens of those countries. It is affecting the environment, and it has to be combated in order to create food. But there's got to be another way. I agree. But I don't know what that way is. So the reality is they're going to fight these things with pesticides, and even the pesticides haven't been that effective. These swarms are growing way too quickly. They're reproducing, and you got to remember, every time they go through a reproduction cycle, 40 times, 20 to 40 times the size they were before, which is why we're looking at a 500-fold increase in locusts between now and June. This is a big problem. They're already eating enough food in a 24-hour period to feed 35,000 people. If you do the math, I'm not even going to try and do that math on the top of my head, but I'll do the math down at the bottom of the screen. This is what it's going to look like in June, how much food they're going to eat. So these locusts aren't just eating crops that are in the fields, they're going after crops that are in storage facilities as well. And that's why I think, you know, at this point, we've already started humanitarian efforts to try and bring food in. But if they're eating the food in storage, they're eating the food out in the fields. I mean, the reality is that there's a lot of food that's going to have to be brought into those countries in order to make up for these locust swarms. And that's going to put further pressure on crops and what we've had as far as crop yields over the course of 2019. It's definitely going to increase the demand for some of those crops through the humanitarian relief that our country and other countries are trying to bring to East Africa. I will say that when we talk about 2019 yields, in my last video I talked about how we just traveled the country. I was eating breakfast with a large grain producer in the Kansas Countryside Motel of Oakley, Kansas, which is right there on the border of Kansas and Colorado. And one of the things that he told me, he was traveling up from Texas back to Nebraska. We were traveling from Colorado back to North Carolina. But what he told me is that they have no clue what their 2019 yields are, and they won't know for months. So these USDA reports that say this is what we estimate the yields at, no. See, they had an issue, with getting crops off the fields. So corn was laying down. They definitely don't have the yields that they were expecting to have. And by the time they got their grains up and to the elevators, they basically have moved those grains into large bag containers that they'll get to later, and that's so that they can kind of move people through the elevator faster. They move the grains in the bags, and then they go back and actually process them and figure out what the yields are and move them into storage. As long as those grains sit in bags, which they've been in there since the fall, for a lot of grain producers, they can mold, they can rot, all sorts of things can happen to those grains that could cause damage to the grains in the bags. So even then, when we still haven't even completely gone through the grains yet and processed them and put them into storage properly, those grains that are being stored in these giant bags, which are a temporary solution, could still go bad. So that's an important thing. Now, he felt like, there were enough grains in the world that we weren't running into a shortage anytime soon. And, as a large grain producer, he talked about how, farmers are able to farm more with technology than they ever have before. But the main gist of the conversation is that they don't know. The farmers don't know what their yields were for 2019. Large producers, these producers that have so many grains going up for market, that they haven't gotten their results back on their yields. So we still don't know where we ended up in 2019. Everything that we talk about with grains for 2019 is hypothetical. And that's kind of the storyline that I took away from that. And now we've got these plagues in Africa. There have been growing issues in the southern hemisphere this year that are causing some grain shortages. I know Brazil has had a harder growing year than they did the year before. So we're starting to see a lot of these different types of scenarios have an impact. And I've read so many articles talking about the locusts being caused by global warming. Let's be clear on something. It's not causing the locust swarms. The locust swarms are being caused by regional increases of rainfall. And this is something that has been long characterized with periods of minimal solar activity. And if you go back and you look at these locust swarm outbreaks, they're decadal, which means that they happen, once a decade. And that decade is not during a solar maximum period. It's happening because we're having localized downpours of rain, which are enabling these insects to be able to reproduce, rapidly grow, and vegetation to grow in areas where it does not normally grow. That is not a cause of anthropogenic global warming. That is an effect of going through a period of solar minimum activity. Now, we all know that 2020 is going to mark a year of the lowest solar activity we've seen in centuries. So this is something, 2019 was the ending of a previous solar cycle. It doesn't actually end until 2020, so the beginning of the next solar cycle is going to be very weak. This year, 2020, could possibly mark the year of the lowest solar activity we've seen in centuries. And so it doesn't surprise me that we're starting to see some of these plagues, some of these weather events and cycles that we're starting to see. When we talk about things like the coronavirus, and I'll do a separate video on this, but the coronavirus is a virus that, whether it started as a, weapon of some sorts, or whether it started as an experiment that went bad, it doesn't change the fact that during solar minimum periods, we have an influx, an increase of cosmic ray activity, which allows viruses and things to basically metamorphosize faster. And I think that has something to do with locusts as well, because remember, these bugs are going through changes in their body. They're going from, a small desert grasshopper state to the incredible Hulk grasshopper. That's what a locust is. And so these changes typically occur, metamorphosis typically occurs during periods of time where there is an increase in cosmic rays. And I think that, as I did, and when I did my African swine flu video, African swine flu had been around for years, started in 2017 in Russia. But when we hit that peak, or when we started getting really deep into the solar cycle with very minimal activity, we started seeing an increase in cosmic rays. That's when we really saw these things take off. With the locusts, if we want to do the best thing for the environment, unfortunately, it would mean to let them go and swarm until they hit a dry spell. When they hit a dry spell, they will eventually, knock off. But until we get through this period in time where we are seeing an increase in localized rainfall, which could be several years, those locusts are probably going to continue to grow and swarm naturally. Now, if they're able to knock them off with pesticides, maybe it will be helpful to our food supply. I don't know. But right now, they're eating enough food in a day to feed 35,000 people. They're going to grow by 500-fold by June. That is a lot of food. That is probably, worse than what we were expecting during the 2019 growing season. That's a lot of food that's going to have to go to Africa to feed those people. That's a lot of food that those bugs are eating. They eat their weight. So each grasshopper that has now turned into this incredible Hulk locust, they eat their weight in food every day. There's billions of them. So that is just, that is something that we all should be paying attention to. I know the media is so focused on other things. They're focused on Pelosi tearing up a speech, which is very childish. But we need to start looking at some of these other things again, start paying attention to what's going on in the world. That is a food supply issue that can affect us here at home. And we all should be aware of and paying attention to. If those locust swarms continue to grow, which I'm sure they will, because there are a lot of rural areas in Africa where they're just going to be able to continue until the cycle dies, which again I think is more of a climate cycle based, and it could take quite some time for that to happen. They're just going to be able to continue to grow and swarm and plague that area for quite some time, and that is a serious issue when it comes to global food supplies.